This is Chapter 11 of The Initiate, Some Impressions of a Great Soul by Cyril Scott. The title of this chapter is The Triumph of Nobility. I shall really have to try and collect the scattered threads of memory, he began. It seems so far back in my life that a great many of the details I have naturally forgotten, besides some of them are of no interest. He got up from his chair and began to walk up and down the room in a state of meditation. Ah, yes, he remembered. It was when we had a villa near Florence, about 10 years after my marriage, and the man's name was, well, I must be discreet, so we will call him Henshaw for our present purpose. After all, he is a most respectable married man with a large family now, so it would not do to give him away. Yes, now I'm beginning to remember a little. And then he started without any further preamble as he sat down in his big chair by the fire. Henshaw had been my guest for about a month, for I did not care to invite any friend to make that long journey from England for the space of a few days. Besides, I had a great affection for him, and was glad that he should remain. And then he proved also an agreeable companion for my wife in times when I was compelled to be away from her for many hours of the day, leaving her to what would otherwise have been loneliness, for she had not many friends and was not over-fond of mere acquaintances. And thus it was to be expected that a close friendship should spring up between my wife and this man, and the wonder was I never divined, before the end of his visit, how close it had become, and how that friendship had finally expanded into love. There came a day, the very day of his departure, when I discovered their hitherto well-guarded secret. For returning at a far earlier time than I had previously intended, I took them quite unawares in the very last hour they had imagined themselves free to take an amorous farewell. And so I saw what they would have given many a long heartache that I should never have seen, for my wife's face blanched with fear and embarrassment, and as for Henshaw, he looked the embodiment of guilt and self-reproach and sorrow and pity all blended into one. There was nothing to be done but to retire, so with my sweetest smile, and without the least touch of sarcasm, I told them in so many words I was extremely sorry to have come upon them so unexpectedly, after which I very hastily withdrew in my confusion. They started to say something, but I did not wait to listen, but making my way downstairs, fetched myself a cigar and passed out into the garden. Then I sat down and began to reproach myself. Why had I not done something, at least to herald my ill-timed approach? The idea of coming upon them like a thief in the night tormented me exceedingly, for she had looked so frightened, and that caused me heart pangs. But then, of course, I had not known, what with the door being slightly ajar and the complete silence within the room. If only she had told me, I reflected, though upon this thought immediately followed the counter-thought of how difficult she had probably found it to do so. She had evidently imagined I should be angry, and in self-defense she had deceived me, and so the whole thing was more or less my fault. Indeed, I ought to have foreseen it all, and when Henshaw became such a constant guest in the house, have realized that they would fall in love, and have warned her that I should not mind, since after all, what could be more natural? Was he not a lovable being? And as to her, well, to my mind she was certainly of the most fascinating type. It was self-evident that I had given her a wrong impression of how I might behave under certain circumstances, and so she had been obliged to hide everything from me. And yet this deception did not weigh in the least on my mind, for I knew full well she need not have deceived me, and I would take great delight in showing her so. For it is the blow we receive to our vanities which causes us to be so apprehensive and hurt at being deceived. It is the most humiliating reflection that, after all, we really are jealous, although we may pretend not to be, and that the deceiver knows this to be a fact, and hence is compelled to dissemble. But with me this was not so, because whatever many vices I can lay at my door, jealousy is not one of them, and hence the thought of others, that I was, or that I might be, did not upset my mental equilibrium. One is seldom hurt at being thought to be a thing one is not. because it is so easy to clear up the mistake, but to be thought to be a thing one really is, that is what rankles in our mind. She had apparently thought me, in this case, to be the old-fashioned sort of husband, forever lurking round the corner with a pistol ready to shoot any intruder upon his rights, the constant pryer into his wife's secrets and affairs. Indeed, a dreadful nightmare of a husband. And had I really been that? Had I really tiptoed along the passage on purpose? Such a conception of me would have been very rancorous. But I had not done such a mean thing, the meanest of all things, for I loved her. And so the whole point was to relieve them of their anxiety. For it certainly occurred to me they must at the moment be feeling extremely uncomfortable. And what was to be done? Should I go back and tell them all was well? Or should I send him a note? For somehow I found it rather awkward to meet him, not knowing what I was going to say. And then, all of a sudden, I remembered he was leaving that very afternoon, and I wondered whether I might disappear till he had gone and afterwards write to him when I had made it all right with her. She could, in fact, enlighten him first, so that a letter from me might not prove too great a shock after what I had led him to believe. In one sense, I was glad the thing had happened, and glad because I would be able to sympathize with her, if she would let me, and make it all so much easier for them. The constant apprehension of my finding out must have been a considerable blot on their happiness, and I wished to remove it. And here my reflections came to an end, for I saw my wife coming towards me across the lawn with a look on her face portraying an admixture of determination, apprehension, and distress. I had seated myself in an arbor at the far end of the garden, so when I saw her approach, I went to meet her and led her back with me to where I had been sitting, showing her an affection she had been far from expecting. So great seemed her astonishment, in fact, that she burst into tears and left me to comfort her as best I could, while, I remember, she made several efforts to say something which, on account of her sobbing, I was unable to comprehend. And then finally she became articulate and told me that, although she had struggled against falling in love with this man, she couldn't resist it, and so at last had given way and had deceived me because she was afraid to cause me unhappiness. You see, I simply couldn't help it, she repeated again and again, and my answer to that was, I don't think anybody can help it, so you are wasting all those self-reproaches on desert air. And then I remember, as with all women, a certain doubt came into her mind, for she said all of a sudden, I can't believe in this kindness. Somehow I think you must be torturing me to punish me all the more afterwards. Have I ever tortured you yet? I asked mildly. No, came her answer. But then I have always been a good wife to you before, and that is all the more reason why I should not torture you now, I smiled out of gratitude. But the deception, she doubted, do you realize how I have deceived you? That is perhaps something or a misfortune you might have spared yourself the trouble, I said with sarcasm. But then I suppose you were frightened to do otherwise. I can't believe it all, she reiterated, and then musingly she questioned, I wonder if you can really love me. Do you mean to say you don't mind? Truly don't mind? Well, not in the least, was my perfectly sincere answer. Then you can't love me, she exclaimed. If your idea of love is to act in a way calculated to make the object of one's love intensely and cruelly unhappy, then no. But if your idea of it is to have a person continually in one's thoughts and to place her happiness before anything else, then yes. After all, it is very simple, I urged. Can you see a loved one suffer when just a little self-schooling could avert that suffering? Besides, supposing I were to cut up rough or strike you or do something equally revengeful, undignified, or childish, what then? You would merely hate me? And if I advise you to give up Henshaw, I should only be like a doctor advising the most unpecunious of his patients to take a trip around the world and thus be merely advising something quite sound in the abstract, no doubt, but almost impossible to carry out. And then she poured into my ears a deluge of admiration, affection, and love, which I would refrain from mentioning, Were I not trying to show you, dear friend, that to be sympathetic even about your wife's love affairs, if she has any, repays you 1,000-fold? I remember she told me how other men would have talked about their wounded honor and other rather childish things, while I, in return, told her that I considered honor only a polite name for vanity, and there were certain countries where a man would foolishly choose rather to have a bullet in his stomach than a wound in his vanity. And also, I went on to tell her that when she promised to love, honor, and obey me, she might as well have added a promise to live till 80 years of age, with as much certainty of being able to fill such a condition. How long that joyful interview would have lasted, I cannot guess, for we were both so happy that I think it might have gone on for hours, and not the more plebeian affairs of everyday domestic life put an untimely end to it. But I will tell you that moment, I blessed in my heart the man whom the majority of people would say had done me an injury, for in reality he was the cause of a far greater unity of soul springing up between my wife and myself, so that each of us knew that, owing to him, our own love had gone through the great fiery ordeal and stood the great test, which perhaps no other combination of circumstances could ever have achieved. He paused for a moment, and then continued in a slightly altered tone. And, my friend, what was the result of it all, and how did it finally pan out? As may be supposed, I let those two see of each other as much as they desired, making no conditions and asking no questions, treating that man as my friend, and asking him to be my guest whenever he felt so inclined. And for some months, things continued like that, until circumstances took him away to India and finally put an end to my wife's amour, in that it died of its own accord as the result of separation. But needless to say, it fell to me to comfort her through the distress of that farewell, and although I felt a real sorrow for her, yet I felt a great joy in that comforting which seemed to draw our souls nearer even than they had been before. And as to what happened after that, it seems hardly necessary to relate, as in my mind there is only one thing that could possibly happen with a nature as true and noble as that of my wife. As the intensity of her sentiment for this other man was really only to a large part the physical in disguise, when he was no longer there to serve as a magnet to draw forth her love, she began to lose interest in him, and, judging from the growing infrequency of his letters, he also in her, and the whole thing dwindled away as if it had never been, yet, as already said, leaving our own love the richer through the very thing that might have torn us irrevocably apart. For in having given my wife no cause for resentment against me, or no reason to feel she was a prisoner in any sense of the word, nothing could act as a factor to stifle her love for myself, but rather augment it to its fullest extent. And seeing also I put no obstacle in her way, not only did I bring no scandal on her, for which she was truly grateful, but I brought no scandal to bear on the matter at all, and the people who might have been all too ready to pronounce me a cuckold were disarmed from the very first. And so, my friend, I think you will be ready to admit that the course I have tried to advise you to pursue was a success in my own case, and I think it must be likewise a success in yours. For remember, the husband who acts up always to the best and truest in him towards his wife must always gain the day, in that lovers are unstable things, coming and going according to varying circumstances, but true conjugal friendship, based on long association, sympathy, and understanding, lasts forever. And here more words ceased, and the Major, looking at him with an admiration and respect he had not shown to so great an extent hitherto, put a question. "Do you hold, then," he asked, "that every husband should allow his wife to have a lover whenever she wants one?" And Moreward smiled as he answered his question. To that I must reply both yes and no, for what you ask depends entirely on the circumstances of the case, and on the wives and husbands concerned, and therefore can never be regulated according to the rule. And just as it is one thing for you to allow your wife lovers, as you allow her jewels and fine dresses, it is quite another to forgive her and condone her actions when she is already in love. For if you command her to renounce the object of her affections, she will either leave you, as in your own case, or else deceive you, to guard herself against the effects of your anger, and that you are exacting something from human nature which it can rarely be expected to fulfill. Moreover, there is nothing which makes a person desire a thing so much as an obstacle put in the way of its gratification, just as there is also nothing that kills affection so soon as the feeling of imprisonment, so that to thwart your wife is to impel her all the more quickly into the arms of the other man, by reason of the resentment you awaken in her heart towards yourself, and thus, by trying to obtain her love by force, you only succeed in losing it altogether. And here Morward ceased again. Well, all I can say is, exclaimed the Major, you are a most amazing fellow, and, what is more, you have done me no end of good. And that ended the matter, and it ended well, for in the course of a few weeks we heard that Mrs. Buckingham and her husband were once more living together, and as far as one could judge, in evident happiness. As for Morward, he said to me when the Major had left, "It is a strange thing what a lot of talking it requires to convince a person of one of the most obvious things in the world. Here am I, having had to place an absurd halo of nobility around myself in order to hold out an inducement for this good man to go and follow my example." "Nobility is always relative," I said, "and what to your evolved nature is obvious is to the Major's heroic noble." Ugh. How about I try that again? Instead of pausing and rewinding and re-recording. Nobility is always relative, I said, and what to your evolved nature is obvious is to the Major's heroically noble. And as I said good night to him, I wondered, was it modesty that made such a very wise man seem at times so remarkably innocent?